Good morning, members. I call the Committee of the Whole on Bill 41, Forest Statutes Amendment Act 2023 to order. We are on Clause 38. Minister.
Prior to beginning questioning, I did want to report to the committee on the question about the forest operation maps, which I said I would get an answer for. So let me just say this, the mapped information must be publicly available for 30 days. The term is 3 years. It will be viewable online and will be held on the platform for an additional 5 years. So I hope that's a satisfactory answer.
Recognizing the Minister from Prince George Mackenzie. The member from Prince George Mackenzie.
The old days. Thank you, Chair. Yeah. Looking at Section 5204 2B, it speaks to an applicant for a cutting permit being required to provide information, plans, studies, or analysis that the Minister considers will assist him in making these decisions. And I go back, I've already mentioned some of these hydrological studies. There's ongoing science reports and various reports, and I know government has also implemented a number of watershed assessments throughout the province in different areas. Are these the types of reports that the Minister will be looking at as a requirement under these applications that are being filed?
Minister.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to make sure that it's understood that while the language is the minister, it's typically the minister's delegate. I don't sit at my desk with a big stack of files and check off individual applications. I don't think I would be able to get through them all. The reason for this provision is that some representatives of industry, and not all, but some, are reluctant to provide the cutting permit issuer with information that must be prepared under the Forest and Range Practices Acts. For example, a site plan. It may be requested, and some companies will refuse to, or contractors will refuse to provide that. Engineering reports, wildlife reports. So this gives the authority to the issuer to request those reports to consider prior to making a decision.
Member.
Well, thank you, Chair. And that was one of the specific reasons why I'm asking the questions, because I'm aware of a lot of those situations. And I assure the Minister, having been in a minister's chair before, I know the Act refers to the Minister doing all these things, but if it wasn't for the staff that's behind you and every other minister we have, there's no way in the world we'd get through those papers. So I completely understand that. A lot of times I have gone and requested various licensees, information on their calculations for ECAs, equivalent clear-cut areas, information on different things happening within the operating area. And of course, they provide the reason that it's proprietary, and they won't release it any further than that. So I'm also troubled that they don't release the information to the ministry as well that's trying to control that. Subsection 3 requires that the information required under sub 2B must be prepared by a person with qualifications specified by the minister. So in this respect, is the minister looking at hydrologists, wildlife ecologists, habitat specialists, or is he looking at a contracting firm that might employ those people, or how specifically are those directions going to be?
Minister.
Thank you. Yes, there will be a requirement that the professional who's preparing the report be a registered professional. So, for example, an engineer, a biologist, a forester, the typical range of professional qualifications that would be expected in order to give a professional opinion.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the answer. This next one deals with 5205, and I know, so I'll address some of it here, but I know 5205 under this particular clause that we're on was also amended in the next clause and then re-amended in the clause after that. So I'm not sure what the reasons were for that. But it states that in 5205 under this particular clause, it says that the minister must refuse to issue a cutting permit if A, the minister determines that taking into account the prescribed matters, issuance of a cutting permit would compromise a prescribed government objective. And those are the objectives under the planning regulations. I'm sure, unless there's some other ones out there. I know recently that the forest planning and practices regulations were amended to remove the, I used to call it a off-ramp clause in there, that they must do all these great things to deal with wildlife habitat and riparian areas and other things, unless it affected the amount of timber available for harvest, whatnot. That clause was removed. But it was amended here a little while ago. What I'm curious about, though, is it my understanding that that clause is still applicable in forest stewardship plans that have yet to expire? And how many of those forest stewardship plans are there? Or is that being completely removed from all forest stewardship plans and is no longer an issue, is no longer something that's considered?
Minister.
Thank you. I want to deal with just the interpretation of Section 5205 Sub A. That was the initial part of the member's question. The second part, perhaps, that we can deal with in a subsequent question. The language that's there is already really repeats the language that exists in the Forest Act with some slight grammatical changes. This authority has only been used once in 2018 to justify the refusal of a permit. It established a government objective, and let me quote, ensuring that BCTS, which is BC Timber Sales, generates adequate cost and price information and data respecting the harvest of representative crown timber through the planning, development, and auction of the authority to harvest timber in BCTS operating areas. There has been a problem, and the member may be familiar with this, where BCTS has done some of the preparation, built the roads, and then someone else will come in, make an application for a cutting permit, and there hasn't been the discretion to refuse that application. So this will give the authority to the issuer to refuse an application in those circumstances. And then perhaps the member could repeat his other question, and we can try to deal with that.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm aware of those kinds of situations as well. So what I'm curious about is the removal of that clause without unduly affecting the amount of timber available for harvest. It was repealed from the regulations recently, but in my understanding, it's still applicable to the existing forest stewardship plans until they expire. So I'm wondering if that is the case, and how many of those forest stewardship plans are in existence today, and how long are they lasting before that clause does no longer apply?
Minister.
Thank you. The existing language in the plan would apply unless the plan is amended or is replaced by a new stewardship plan or a forest landscape plan. In terms of the number of forest stewardship plans, that's not available right at the moment. We'll get that information for you. And also, I think I acknowledged the member's question about the duration of these forest stewardship plans, and we'll endeavor, insofar as it's possible, to get that information to you as well.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. So I think I understand that clause still applies to the existing forest stewardship plans unless they have been amended, which probably many of them haven't been with respect to that part of it. So I'll appreciate hearing back on that information when the minister provides it. On the same, in the same area, the issuance of a cutting permit would compromise a prescribed government objective. And the government objectives, I'm assuming, are all the objectives that are listed under Part 2 of Division 1 in the Planning and Practices Regulation. The government objectives set for soils, for timber, for wildlife, for water, fish and wildlife, and biodiversity within riparian areas. Are those the objectives that this section covers as well?
Minister.
Thank you. The focus of the cutting permit will be site-specific considerations. So I think it's important to remember that in the planning process, a number of considerations will already have been taken place and prepared in the process of leading up to the application for a permit. And the general principle that will guide that discretion is the management and conservation of forests as objectives in that process. So that's the process. It's not a new decision. It's a refinement of the previous decisions that are specific to the site that's being brought forward.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. So 3.1 addresses the management and conservation of forest resources, and we heard yesterday from the minister that this includes all aspects of forest, the biodiversity, hydrology, all those types of things. So my question really hasn't been answered with respect to the objectives set by government are applicable under 5205 when 5205 refers to a prescribed government objective. Are all the objectives under the planning and practices regulations dealing with the riparian objectives, wildlife, water, those kinds of things, are they part of the objectives that need to be considered under 5205?
Minister.
Thank you. So let me try this. The header is above the section is a mandatory refusal to hear a cutting permit. So this is a fairly narrow, circumscribed discretion where the issuer is obliged to refuse a permit. In order to do that, you need a specific regulation, and that one exists. That's the one that I made reference to in the case of the BCTS situation where there'd been work done and someone came along applying for a cutting permit after, say, a road had been built or something like that. So I just want to emphasize in what I'm saying here the fairly narrow focus of this particular section.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. So this is under the new section 3.1, cutting permits. and a requirement to obtain cutting permits. We talked about the issuance of cutting permits and applications for cutting permits under 5204, and the mandatory refusal to issue a cutting permit. So what information would the minister have by this time? Mandatory refusal. So it comes before the minister or the delegate, and that person has to take into consideration whether or not that issuing the permit would compromise a prescribed government objective. So bearing in mind all of these prescribed objectives that are listed in the planning and practices regulations, what information would that decision maker have with respect to a certain area that's being cut, whether or not it is compromising or has complied with the objective set by government? And I want to get into a couple of other areas there once I hear the answer from the minister.
Minister.
Okay, thank you. I think the answer is fairly nuanced, but let me try this. This decision in considering an application is the first decision that would be considered. Wouldn't get to considering the other objectives if, because the decision maker is obliged to, it's mandatory to consider this. So the decision maker will have the BC timber sales maps, an operation plan. If there's BC Timber Sales has already done some work in the area, then the obligation is to, and the decision maker is required to refuse the permit full stop at that stage. You don't get to considering the other objectives in this process in that case. This is the first decision, or the first aspect of the decision, and if the applicant can't overcome that hurdle, then the permit is refused.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. So I know we're going to be breaking for lunch here. So basically, I'm getting the picture of a process that is separate and siloed, and one particular part of the ministry will look at some of these objectives, and then it goes to the next level. And by the time it gets to this particular stage for mandatory refusal for issuing a cutting permit, a whole bunch of preliminary work has been done. But what I'm hearing from the minister, the person making the decision on behalf of the minister for this particular section won't be privy to all these other decisions and what was considered in those other decisions. And I guess what I'm reading into this is that this is a stopgap, or not a stopgap. This is a critical. It's a mandatory refusal to issue a cutting permit. It's the last step. So the decision maker has to consider all these other factors to make sure that all the checks and balances have been put in place and everything is done by the time it gets to this particular stage. And maybe something has surfaced indicating that maybe the applicant is deficient in some of these areas here. So am I reading that right? Is this sort of basically how that works? And then we'll get into some more of that after lunch.
Minister.
Thank you. The permit or the opportunity to make an application for the permit emerges from a planning process which identifies areas where that would be appropriate. But it comes to a single decision maker, and there is a process. It's not legally mandated what order they're considered in, but it's a logical way to consider the application. If the application fails to pass this test that the application has to comply with, and it doesn't, it's mandatory to refuse that permit. So that's why the decision maker would likely, in the decision tree or matrix or however you call it, that would be addressed early on, and then you wouldn't get to considering the other aspects of issuing and the discretion, the new discretion that this affords to the decision maker, because it would be basically stopped at that stage. If you can't pass that hurdle, the application doesn't go forward, the decision maker is obliged to refuse it, and so the process ends there. I move the committee rise, report progress, and ask leave to sit again.
Members, the question is that the committee rise, report progress, and seek leave to sit again. Those in favor indicate aye. Aye. Those opposed indicate nay. Motion is carried. This committee stands adjourned.